The dark truth behind the children who murder. What if a group of children were trapped in an endless, dark cycle, and one of them discovered the terrifying truth that could break them free forever? This chilling story will take you on a journey through darkness, mystery, and hope. But who will survive? Watch till the end to uncover the shocking twist. The sun had just begun to dip beneath the horizon. The streets of the small town were empty. A chill crept through the air. Alice felt it on her neck. She quickened her pace, eyes darting around. The shadows seemed to stretch, elongating as the last light faded. There was no sound except for her footsteps, echoing on the cobbled road. Suddenly, she heard a soft whisper. She froze. It came from behind her. The voice was so faint, so quiet. "Turn around," it said. Her heart raced, but she couldn't. Not yet. Her feet felt glued to the ground. She tried to breathe, slow and steady, but the air felt thicker, heavier. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Turn around." A shiver ran down her spine. Her fingers trembled. Slowly, she turned. The alley behind her was empty. The air was damp, thick with a lingering fog. No one. Nothing. She sighed, a mix of relief and confusion. But then she noticed something. A figure, standing at the end of the alley. A child. He was wearing a tattered red coat, his face hidden in shadows. Alice took a step forward. The child didn't move. She called out, her voice shaking. "Hey, are you lost?" No answer. She took another step, closer now. "Do you need help?" Her voice cracked. Still no answer. She was almost there, standing just a few feet away from the child. He looked up. His eyes were wide, unblinking. They were dark, too dark, like bottomless pits. Alice felt her breath catch. The child tilted his head. "Run," he whispered. Before she could react, his small hand shot out, gripping her wrist. His touch was cold, cold like death. And then the world went black. The last thing Alice heard was the soft sound of children's laughter. Low, hollow, echoing in the distance. And then nothing. When Alice opened her eyes, she was no longer in the alley. The air was warmer here, but it smelled wrong, like old, damp wood and decay. She blinked, trying to focus. The ground beneath her was soft. She was lying on a bed, a small cot. The walls around her were cracked and covered in a thick layer of dust. A single dim light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering faintly. A low hum filled the room. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. And then she heard it, the sound of tiny footsteps, the patter of small feet on the floor. They were approaching. Her pulse quickened. Her throat was dry. She sat up, suddenly aware of how heavy her limbs felt. The door creaked open slowly. A figure appeared in the doorway. A child. The same one. The one with the dark eyes. He was standing there, watching her. This time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, there were others. A group of them. All children. They were all staring at her. Their faces blank. Their eyes empty. Alice could feel the air grow colder again. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The child in the front stepped forward. He was holding something, a small, rusted knife. His eyes never left hers as he slowly approached the bed. Alice's heart leapt into her throat. She couldn't move. Her legs felt like lead. The child stopped just at the edge of the cot. His grip tightened around the knife's handle. "I told you to run," he said softly. His voice was the same quiet whisper from before. "But you didn't listen," he continued. Alice tried to scream, but her voice was lost in the thick, suffocating silence. The children stepped closer, one by one, their hands reaching out. Small, cold hands. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The knife glinted in the dim light. And then, a single word, a command. "Join us." Alice's breath hitched in her throat. Her skin crawled as the children moved closer. Each step they took was deliberate, unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world. The cold air thickened. The faint hum from the corner of the room grew louder. It seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her heartbeat. "Join us." The words echoed in her mind. They weren't just words. They were a pull, a force, something deeper than fear, Something darker. The child in the front held the knife out closer now. Its dull blade reflected the dim light in twisted patterns. "Join us," he repeated, his voice now almost a chant. His eyes were so dark, so empty. Alice could feel her chest tighten, her throat closing, her limbs paralyzed. "Please," she whispered, but the words barely left her lips. Her eyes darted around the room. The walls seemed to press in, shrinking with every passing second. The children closed in tighter. Their faces were blank, but their eyes, those eyes, they were filled with something. Something that was not human. Not at all. The child with the knife leaned closer, his breath cold on her skin. "Do you hear them?" he asked. Alice tried to shake her head, tried to scream, but no sound came. And then, from the shadows, she heard it. A low murmur, a chant. It came from behind her, from the corner of the room. The children stood still, their heads slightly tilted, as if listening. The murmur grew louder. It was calling to her. Her eyes widened in panic. The hum grew deafening. "Join us," the children whispered, their voices now in unison. Alice turned to the corner of the room. A figure was emerging from the shadows. It was tall. It had no face, just a shifting, swirling mass of darkness. It stepped forward. The children parted, as if they were waiting for it. It moved closer to Alice. The air grew colder, her breath visible in the thickening frost. "Join us," the figure whispered. It was no longer just a whisper. It was a command, a pull. Something inside Alice snapped. She could feel her will shattering, her body shaking. The figure was close now, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. Her mind screamed for escape, but her body refused to move. Her eyes met the faceless figure, and in that instant she understood. She understood everything. This was their world. This was their place. The children, they were not innocent. They were the keepers, the ones who took, who dragged the living into the dark. And Alice was their next. The knife was pressed against her skin, cold, sharp, but it wasn't the blade that hurt. It was the pull, the darkness, the desire to join them, to become one with them. The children reached out, their hands like ice. And Alice, despite every ounce of her will, let go. And the darkness swallowed her whole. The world around Alice went black. Not the gentle dark of night, the silence deafening. But somewhere, in the depths of her fading consciousness, Lily understood. She wasn't just joining them. She was becoming part of the endless cycle. A whisper, a shadow, a lost soul. The faceless figure loomed above her, its presence like a weight on her chest. The boy with the red coat smiled, a cold, hollow smile. "You will never leave," he said, his voice like a whisper in the wind. "You are one of us now." And Lily's body went limp, her eyes glazed over, her soul erased, her name forgotten. Just another lost child in the endless dark. The children circled around her, their faces expressionless, their eyes still empty. The void closed in, and the cycle began again. Another child would come, another soul would be lost. The void stretched out endlessly, an eternal darkness that consumed everything. But the cycle never broke. It simply repeated, over and over. Each time, another child, another soul, and another whisper in the dark. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but the silence. The deep, suffocating silence of lost souls. But then there was a shift, a tremor in the air, a ripple in the darkness. Another presence. This one was different. This one fought against the pull. A boy. His name was Thomas. He wasn't like the others. He could feel the weight of the void pressing against him, suffocating him. But unlike the others, he was aware. He remembered. He remembered his name, the town, his family. He fought to stay connected to his past, to the world he had come from. But the whispers, they were always there, calling him, pulling at him, luring him in. "Join us." The voices echoed in his mind. His hands trembled, his body shaking with the force of the pull. But Thomas refused. He remembered. He fought back. With every ounce of strength he had, he pushed against the darkness, against the cold that tried to swallow him whole. And just as the weight of the void threatened to crush him, He saw it, a flicker of light, a spark, a glimpse of something real. For a moment, it felt like the darkness was retreating. For a brief second, he wasn't alone. The children, the ones who had taken Alice, Lily, and countless others, flickered like shadows around him. Their empty eyes stared, but there was something different in their gaze. Something hollow, something vacant. They were trapped here too, just like him. He saw their faces, pale, cold, and lifeless. But he saw the flicker of recognition. They didn't belong here, not completely. Thomas understood. They were victims, like him. And for a fleeting moment, the pull was lessened. The whispers weakened. Thomas had an idea. It wasn't much, but it was something. He turned to the children, his voice shaky but determined. "Do you want to be free?" he asked, his words trembling in the silence. The boy with the red coat stepped forward. His face was still empty, but his eyes, those dark, bottomless pits, focused on Thomas. For the first time, the boy seemed to hesitate. The others watched. There was a moment of stillness. And then the boy spoke, his voice barely audible. "You can't save us." Thomas felt the cold bite of truth sink in. But he had to try. "I'm not trying to save you," Thomas replied, his voice gaining strength. "I'm trying to save me." The children stared. They didn't move, and the darkness around them began to pulse. A rhythm, a heartbeat, like the world was alive, like it was listening. Thomas stepped back, his heart racing. He didn't know what he was doing, but he couldn't stay here. Not like them, not like Alice, not like Lily, not like anyone who had lost themselves in this place. As he took another step back, something strange happened. The darkness shuddered, the void around him rippled, and a crack appeared in the air. A faint light leaked through. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Thomas stepped forward, toward the crack. He reached out. His hand brushed against the edge of the light, and suddenly he felt it. The pull, the cold, the darkness. It all rushed toward him. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't the crushing weight of emptiness. It was a choice. Thomas closed his eyes. His heart pounded, and he stepped through the crack. The darkness howled, but the light swallowed it. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Thomas was free. The children stared. They watched as the boy, their last hope, vanished into the light. Their eyes, still empty, turned toward the next arrival. Another child, another soul, and the cycle began again. And the darkness would never end. The light that had swallowed Thomas flickered, pulsed, and then vanished. The crack closed. The darkness resumed its suffocating grip. The children stood still, watching the spot where Thomas had disappeared. Their faces remained the same, empty, hollow, endless. But something had shifted, something different. The boy with the red coat turned his head slightly, his empty gaze lingering on the place where Thomas had stepped into the light. A faint whisper stirred in the air. It wasn't the usual chant, the same relentless pull. This was a question. Will we ever escape? The whisper was soft, barely audible, but it echoed in the void. It came not from the faceless figure, nor from any of the children, but from somewhere deeper. A presence older and darker than the children themselves responded. No one escapes. The voice was a cold, distant echo, like the sound of wind through an abandoned place. And yet, for the briefest moment, the boy in the red coat's head twitched. A flicker of doubt crossed his eyes. The others remained still, watching. The shadows swirled. The faceless figure, once a constant looming presence, stirred in the corner of the room, where light had never touched. Its form seemed to writhe, as if it, too, was uncertain. But no matter how hard they fought against the void, no matter how much they yearned for escape, they could not break free. The cycle would continue. Another child would come. Another would hear the whispers. And they, too, would be drawn into the endless dark. But somewhere in the depths of the void, a strange thought began to grow, like a seed in the dark soil of a forgotten world. A thought that was not theirs. A thought that could not belong to the children or the faceless figure. It was a thought of defiance. It was the thought of something that could break the cycle. Something that could shatter the darkness. A light. A spark. Something new. In the distance, far beyond the reach of the cold grip of the void, something shifted again. The whispers stopped. The children turned toward the sound, but a suffocating, oppressive void. Her senses were swallowed whole. No sound, no light, no air, only cold. A cold so deep, it sank into her bones. She felt herself drifting, floating in nothingness. Her mind fractured. Images flashed before her eyes. Flickers of a life she once knew. The town, her home, the people she loved. But they were all fading away like smoke in the wind. Her fingers twitched, but they felt numb, like she wasn't even there. Then she heard a voice. Low, hollow. Alice. It was the child's voice. But it wasn't the same. It sounded distorted, like it came from somewhere far, far away. Alice. She tried to respond, tried to speak, but her voice wouldn't come. Her mouth felt sealed. Alice, listen. The voice was closer now. Closer and clearer. You are here with us. You always were. Alice felt a sharp pain, like needles digging into her mind. A rush of memories. Images of the children. The empty eyes. The dark figure. It all crashed back. A feeling of loss. Of being ripped away from something she couldn't understand. The cold deepened. Her heartbeat was the only sound left. Loud. Thundering. But it was different now. Not her heartbeat. Not her body. She couldn't feel anything. She couldn't feel herself. She was becoming part of them. Join us, Alice. The voice now surrounded her. The children's faces appeared, not as they were, but as she was becoming. Empty eyes. Cold hands reaching. Her own face was fading, blurring. The darkness crept in, wrapping around her, swallowing her in layers. The pull was too strong now. She couldn't fight it anymore. Her own will was lost. She was becoming like them, like the ones who had come before her, the ones who whispered in the dark, the ones who had no past, no future, only the endless cold, only the silence. And then, a sharp pain, like a crack through glass. Her mind split. A voice. A scream. Her own. But it wasn't her anymore. The scream was not a plea for help. It was the sound of surrender. It was the sound of a soul slipping away. And when the scream faded, there was only silence. And the children. All standing. All waiting. Alice was no more. The darkness was their home now. And soon, another would come. Another would whisper. Another would listen. And they would take them too. One by one. Until there was nothing left. Time had no meaning here. There was no dawn. No dusk. Just the perpetual, suffocating void. The darkness felt infinite. A weight that pressed against everything. And yet the children remained. Always waiting. Their eyes, empty and cold, flickered in the endless shadow. Their faces were the same as they had always been. And in that void something shifted. A new presence. A faint sound. Footsteps. Small. Quick. Closer. The children stood still, watching. The new arrival entered the space. A girl. Her name was Lily. She was just like Alice. Her eyes wide with fear. Her heart pounding. She had wandered too far. She had followed the wrong path. Lily had no idea what was waiting. She only knew the whispers. The ones that called her name. They had followed her. Pulled her here. Just as they had done with Alice. And before her countless others. Lily froze. She could feel the eyes upon her. The coldness in the air wrapped itself around her throat, squeezing. Her breath quickened. She turned around, but the shadows shifted, blocking her path. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The children took a single step forward. Lily stumbled back. Her hands shook. She looked down at her feet. The ground was soft. Mud. Wet earth. The smell of decay filled her nose. It was the same as before. The same place. The same world. She was here now. And there was no escape. Lily's pulse raced. Her heart hammered in her chest. But she couldn't run. Not now. The children closed in slowly. They had done this countless times. They knew the game. The game was always the same. Join us, they whispered. The words came like a chant, a song, a siren's call. Lily's legs shook. Her feet felt heavy. A scream rose in her throat, but it died before it reached her lips. Something cold touched her wrist. A hand. A tiny, ice-cold hand. Lily looked down. It was one of them. One of the children. The boy with the red coat. His empty eyes locked onto hers. "Join us," he repeated, his voice softer now, almost tender. Lily wanted to pull away, to fight, to scream, but the pull was already there. It was too strong. Her head felt foggy. Her limbs felt like lead. She looked around at the others. The faces blank, empty. And then she saw it. The figure in the shadows. The one that had no face. It was watching her, waiting. Its presence loomed over her, heavy. The cold pressed in closer. Lily's body trembled. She was afraid. Afraid of the darkness. Afraid of the children. But most of all, she was afraid of what she might become. Because she knew. She knew that, like Alice before her, there would be no escape. The moment she gave in, she would become like them. A lost soul in the endless dark. A part of the whispers. A part of the cold. And the cycle would continue. A never-ending game. With no winner. Only the lost. The children smiled. Empty smiles. And Lily's scream, though silent, echoed in the void. A scream that would never reach anyone. A scream that would never be heard. Because in the end, there was no one left to hear it. Lily's legs gave way beneath her. She collapsed to the cold, damp earth. Her hands scraped against the ground. But there was no grip. Only the soft, sinking mud. She felt the weight of the void pressing down on her, suffocating her. The whispers were louder now. More insistent. They curled around her thoughts, like tendrils of smoke. She tried to shut them out, but they were inside her, filling her mind, her soul. "Join us." It was the only thing she could hear now. Her heart pounded in her chest, faster and faster. The chill in the air crawled deeper into her skin, gnawing at her bones. She trembled. The boy with the red coat was still there. His small, cold hand still gripped her wrist, pulling her toward him. "Join us." The words were a command she could no longer resist. Her vision blurred, her thoughts scattered. The figure in the shadows, the faceless one, stepped closer. Its presence was overwhelming. It filled the entire space with its absence. A deep, empty void. Lily's eyes locked onto the faceless figure. The pull was undeniable now. There was no turning back. Her body moved against her will. Her arms lifted, as if in a trance. She was walking toward them. Toward the children. Toward the cold. Her fingers twitched. They were becoming like them. Small. Pale. Empty. Her body was no longer her own. The darkness around her thickened, swirling like a storm, a vortex of shadow and despair. And then she felt it. A shift. A change. The ground beneath her feet gave way, and she fell into the void, into the same blackness where Alice had disappeared. The cold was unbearable. For a moment the silence was deafening. And then, in the farthest corner of the darkness, a new sound reached their ears. A voice. Not a whisper. Not a chant. But a voice, full of fear and desperation. "Where am I?" The voice was young. A child's voice. The boy in the red coat looked toward the sound, his empty eyes narrowing. Another child. Another soul. Another plaything for the darkness. The boy stepped forward, but as he did, a sudden shock of energy pulsed through the void. A surge of light. The children recoiled, their faces blank, but their bodies stiffened with uncertainty. The faceless figure flinched. Something was different this time. This time, there was no pull, no whisper. There was only the voice of the child, and the light. The boy with the red coat hesitated. His small hands twitched. The darkness trembled. It was as if something was fighting back. The void seemed to shift. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a ripple of hope, a crack in the perfect dark, a tiny flicker of light in the cold, endless night. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. The children gathered around the new arrival, their faces expressionless, their eyes fixed on the trembling child who had just arrived. They reached out their cold, bony hands. Their touch was inevitable. The cycle would continue. But something was different now. The cracks were spreading. The light was growing. And for the first time in an age, the void seemed just a little less certain, a little less eternal. The children, for a brief moment, stopped. They looked up. They waited. And the darkness whispered once again, "Will you join us?" The question hung in the air, heavy and cold, like a shroud. "Will you join us?" The child, trembling and wide-eyed, stood frozen. The whispers curled around them, soft at first, like a lullaby. But each word was a thread, weaving tighter and tighter around their mind. The child, his name was David, felt the pull. It was subtle, but undeniable. He wanted to scream, to run, but his feet refused to move. His mind, like the others before him, felt as if it were clouded by fog. The whispers grew louder. The boy with the red coat stepped closer, his empty gaze still fixed on David, as if studying him. For a moment, David wondered if the boy was different from the others. There was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, something almost human. But then, just as quickly, the flicker was gone. "Join us," the red-coated boy repeated, his voice barely more than a breath. David's chest tightened. He could feel his heart pounding, louder than the whispers. "Why?" David croaked, his voice cracking. "Why do you do this?" The children around him moved closer, their faces blank, but their eyes filled with an unsettling stillness. The boy in the red coat didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just looked at David, his eyes deep and empty, as if waiting for something. David's heart pounded faster, louder, his breath shallow and uneven. "Don't you see?" the red-coated boy finally whispered, his voice almost a sigh. "It isn't our choice." The words made no sense. David could feel his mind struggling to comprehend them. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice a shaky plea. The boy's eyes flickered again. A trace of something almost like regret, passed across his face. "We were just like you," the boy murmured. "Once." The words sent a chill through David's spine. He could hear the hollow echo of them, like they were not just a warning, but a promise. Something worse than fear stirred inside him. "Join us," the boy repeated, but this time it was softer, more desperate. David shook his head violently, trying to tear himself away from the pull, from the weight of the words. He glanced around. The others, the faceless ones, stood motionless. It was like they were waiting, watching, but not truly alive. The boy in the red coat reached out, his hand trembling slightly. "Once you're here, you can't leave," he said, as if warning David. "We all have our place. We can't escape. None of us can." The darkness around them seemed to breathe, to pulse in rhythm with their words. It felt like it was alive, like it was watching. And then, just as David was about to speak, a new sound filled the air. A sound not from the darkness, but from the light. It was faint at first, a crackling sound like distant thunder. David's head snapped toward the source, his breath catching in his throat. There was a light, small at first, shining in the far corner of the void, beyond the children. Beyond the David felt something shift inside him, a flicker of hope. Could it be? Could there be a way out? The boy in the red coat, seeing the shift in David's expression, followed his gaze. His face twisted, not in anger, but in fear. "No," the boy said, his voice trembling. "You don't understand. It's too late for you. For all of us." But David's eyes were locked on the light. The pull of it was stronger now. He could feel it tugging at him. It wasn't the same as the darkness. It wasn't the same as the whispers. This light was pure. It was hope. David took a step toward it. And then, as if the void itself was trying to stop him, the temperature dropped. The air grew colder. The darkness surged forward, wrapping around his legs, his arms, pulling him back. The children moved with it, closing in. Their hands reached out. Cold, clammy. "Join us," they whispered again. David fought, his heart racing, his hands shaking. He felt the weight of the void pressing down on him, pushing him, trying to break him. But he didn't stop. The light pulsed again, stronger this time. David stepped forward, his body trembling, every instinct screaming for him to run. But he wasn't running. He was fighting. And as his foot touched the ground closer to the light, a shock of energy coursed through him. The darkness screamed. The children recoiled. The faceless figure, it seemed to waver. The light grew brighter. It was blinding now. David didn't look back. His hand reached toward the light. His fingers brushed against the warmth. And in that instant everything shattered. The whispers, the pull, the void, the cold. It all collapsed. And David disappeared. But as he vanished, the children were left behind. The boy in the red coat stood still, staring at the place where David had been. The void returned to silence. But something had changed. The cycle had been broken. And in the distance, the faintest trace of light flickered. The faceless figure shifted, a ripple through its dark form, as if it too was feeling something it could not quite understand. A new sensation hung in the air, something beyond fear, something like uncertainty. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, but it was different now. The oppressive weight of the darkness felt less certain, less absolute. A ripple moved through the void, unnoticed by the children, but keenly felt by the faceless figure. A presence new, unfamiliar, had arrived. The whispers, which had once been constant, began to fade. They didn't disappear entirely, but their power had waned. The void felt less like an inescapable prison, and more like something that could be torn apart, something that could be defeated. The boy in the red coat tilted his head, his eyes scanning the space around him. For the first time, his gaze seemed to linger not on the darkness, but on something else, something beyond it. He took a step forward, then another, moving towards the fading light, drawn to it despite the pull of the void, despite the cold grip of the darkness that had always been his home. As his footsteps echoed in the silence, the other children remained still. They didn't follow him. The red-coated boy stopped just at the edge of the shadow, where the darkness met the light. He turned his head, looking at the faceless figure for guidance. But the faceless figure didn't move. It just watched. For the first time, the boy felt a flicker of something foreign, something human. The boy in the red coat reached out with trembling fingers, as if trying to touch the light. But he hesitated. His hand hovered in the air. The darkness around him seemed to pulse, pressing in on him, trying to pull him back. He resisted. The light, though faint, seemed to call to him. It wasn't the cold, relentless pull of the void. It was warm, inviting, a light that offered the possibility of something else, something beyond the endless cycle. The boy in the red coat stepped forward again, and this time, he didn't hesitate. His hand brushed against the light. It was warm. It was alive. A shock of energy coursed through his body, and for the first time, he felt something inside him stir, something that wasn't cold, something that wasn't empty. For the first time, he felt alive. And then, as his hand lingered in the light, something strange happened. The void trembled. The children, who had always been shadows in the dark, shifted. Their faces, though still hollow, seemed to change. Their bodies began to flicker, as if they were made of smoke, their outlines unstable. The boy in the red coat looked back at them, his heart pounding, his breath quickening. "No," he whispered to himself, his voice a raw murmur in the vast emptiness. It's possible." The faceless figure, sensing the change, stirred. It was no longer the towering, unyielding presence it had been. Now it seemed uncertain. It swayed, as if struggling to hold itself together. The darkness pressed in, but the boy's hand stayed in the light, pushing forward. A low, guttural growl echoed from the faceless figure. "No one leaves," it hissed, its voice like the scrape of bone against stone. But the boy, his eyes wide with something that wasn't fear, but determination, shook his head. "I'm not joining you anymore." With that, the boy stepped fully into the light, and the void screamed. It was a sound that echoed through the endless dark, a sound of agony, a sound of something breaking. The boy in the red coat let out a soft gasp as the light surged, wrapping around him, blinding in its intensity. The darkness screamed louder. The children, their figures now flickering in and out of existence, seemed to writhe in pain. The cold grasp of the void, once so powerful, began to slip. It could no longer hold them. It could no longer hold anything. And then, in one final burst of light, the boy in the red coat vanished. The void was left empty, silent. For a moment, there was nothing but the faintest shimmer of the light, lingering in the corner where the boy had stood. The faceless figure, now fragmented and trembling, slowly faded away, its presence dissipating into the cold nothingness. The children, the ones who had once been shadows, flickered one last time, their forms melting away into the dark. The cycle was broken, and for the first time in an eternity, the darkness was silent. There was no whisper, no pull, no one to join, only the faint, distant trace of light, faint but real, glimmering in the farthest corner of the void. And somewhere, far beyond the darkness, there was freedom. The endless cycle was over, and the light was finally winning the void. Once an unyielding expanse of endless shadow, now felt different. It was lighter, though the darkness was still vast. The silence that had once been oppressive, stifling, now seemed uncertain, as though the very fabric of the void had been stretched, torn open, and the darkness could no longer hold its shape. There was no longer a pull, no longer the gnawing force urging souls to join, to become part of the unbroken cycle. The light, though faint, lingered. It pulsed in the distance, small but steady, like a heartbeat in the dark. It wasn't a blinding light, but a quiet one. It wasn't harsh. It didn't burn. It was soft, warm, a sliver of something hopeful in a world that had forgotten hope. The emptiness around it felt less empty now, less cold. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And there, in the very heart of the void, a faint voice stirred. A whisper, not the kind that had once come from the darkness, urging the lost souls to join. Not the kind that demanded or consumed. This was different. It was gentle. The voice, soft and uncertain, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a whisper of despair. It was a whisper of awakening. Are we free now? The voice echoed through the stillness, like a fragile thought in a room that had long been empty. It wasn't loud, but it carried with it the weight of something profound. The children were gone. The faceless figure was gone. The boy in the red coat, who had once been a part of the cycle, was gone too. And yet, in the heart of the void, something remained. Something had changed. A new presence stirred, not an echo of the past, but a beginning, a possibility. The light flickered again, growing slightly brighter. A faint warmth now radiated from it, and the silence no longer seemed so overwhelming. The darkness, still present but no longer all-encompassing, seemed to retreat, just a little. In the distance, there was the faintest outline of something, a shape perhaps, a figure small, distant, but unmistakable. The first new soul. It wasn't like the others. Not like Alice. Not like Lily. Not like David. This soul didn't come from the pull of the void. It didn't come from the whispers. It didn't belong to the darkness. It had come from beyond it. The figure, small and delicate, moved toward the light. The soul was a child not drawn by the shadows, but guided by something far stronger than any whisper. The presence of the light was different now. It wasn't a trap. It wasn't a place to be consumed. It wasn't a prison. It was a door, a passage, a way out. And this child, this new soul, had come from somewhere beyond the endless dark, beyond the broken cycle. They were not here by accident. They were here because the light had made a way. The child reached forward, hesitant at first, but then, with growing confidence, their fingers brushed against the warmth of the light, and the light embraced them. There was no scream, no sudden pull, no overwhelming sensation of being lost. There was only peace. The darkness trembled one last time, but this time, it did not roar. It didn't fight back. It simply faded, and the child, with a soft breath, stepped through the light and disappeared. The void, for the first time, was completely still, empty, but no longer silent. The ripples of change had begun. They weren't over, but they had started. The darkness, which had once been all-powerful, was no longer what it had been. The light that had once been a distant hope was now a reality. The cycle was broken, and as the last traces of the void began to dissolve, something new emerged from the remains. Not a shadow, not an echo, but something alive, something free. The last whispers faded away, but they were no longer the haunting, consuming kind. This time, they were words of release, of promise, and for the first time in eternity, there was no longer a question of who would join. There was only the gentle promise that someday, somewhere, something would remain, something beautiful. And for the first time, the darkness was truly empty. The light had won. The void was silent, stretched thin and hollow, as if the very fabric of existence had been unraveled. There was no more pull, no more whispers curling through the darkness. It was as if the universe had held its breath and finally exhaled. And then the smallest spark appeared. At first, it was imperceptible, just a glimmer, a faint flicker of light in the distance. But this light was not the same as the one before. It was stronger, more insistent, more alive. It pulsed like the heartbeat of something new, something different. The void trembled slightly, a shudder that ran through the very edges of nothingness. And then the light spread, slowly at first, like ripples in water, widening and growing. It stretched across the dark expanse, touching the corners of the void where shadows had once held sway. It spread with a warmth that was foreign to this place, like the first rays of dawn creeping over the horizon after a long night. The cold that had gripped the void for so long began to recede. Slowly, but unmistakably, the emptiness was filled with something else, something living. In the center of this new light stood a figure. The child, the first one to arrive after the cycle had been broken. Their eyes were wide, filled with wonder and confusion, but also with something else. Hope, the promise of something beyond the shadows. The child stood still for a moment, as if unsure what to do, as if the world around them hadn't quite settled. Then they took a step, one small, tentative movement into the warmth, and as their feet touched the light, the world around them shifted. The darkness recoiled, not in anger, but in something else, in surrender. It was as if the void had realized that it no longer had power here. The pull, the whispers, the endless cycle, they were gone. Gone because they had been replaced with something stronger. Something that wasn't bound by the past. Something that wasn't a part of the endless loop of despair. The child continued to walk forward, the light now fully enveloping them. Each step seemed to add more light to the world around them, and the darkness continued to fade. The void wasn't defeated, not in the way one defeats an enemy. It simply no longer existed. The cycle had ended. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. The child reached forward, their hand stretching out into the light, and with a single breath, they stepped into something new. And for the first time in all of eternity, the void was truly empty. Nothing remained. Only the light. Only freedom. And somewhere, far beyond the dark, a new world began to take shape. The light had spread now, stretching across the infinite expanse, blanketing the void in its soft, golden warmth. The darkness had receded, no longer a force of weight or fear. The absence, the emptiness, that had once been so suffocating now felt peaceful. The echoes of the past were gone. The cycle, once unbreakable, had dissolved completely, leaving behind only the stillness. And in the center of it all, the child stood alone, bathed in the glow of something that was not a light of this world. It was not harsh, nor was it blinding. It was simply there, a quiet presence that filled the space, not with noise, but with quiet purpose. The child, now standing with an air of calm assurance, looked up. Their gaze wandered through the vastness, no longer searching, no longer feeling the emptiness that had once stretched endlessly before them. For the first time, they saw that there was something here, something to fill the space, something not born of darkness or fear, but born of possibility. There was no need to rush forward, no need to flee the shadows. There was no longer any fear of the pull, the whispers, the force that had always been there, unseen but ever present. It was as though all the parts of their existence that had once been broken had come together. The emptiness within them no longer needed to be filled with the things that once consumed them. The child closed their eyes for a brief moment, and in that quiet pause, they felt the world around them shift once more. The darkness was not gone, but it had been reshaped. No longer was it a place to fear, a place of torment and pain. It had been transformed into something soft, gentle. In its place was the beginning of something new, something born from the light. The child smiled, a small, serene smile that seemed to embrace the silence. They opened their eyes, and the light around them shimmered as if in response. No longer a void, no longer a prison, only a space boundless and full of possibility. In this new world, there was no question of who would be free. There was only the knowing that freedom was possible. And in that knowing, the child stepped forward, leaving the past behind, and into the future, into the unknown. The journey had ended, but in its ending, it had only just begun. And the light continued to pulse, soft and steady, in the heart of the void, until, at last, the space was filled with something even greater than light. It was hope. The world was whole again, and it would never be the same.